And then welcome everybody to the virtual Kant Congress. I'm Andrew Schignell. I'm one of the co-organizers along with Z Quanbeck, who is here, Karin de Boer and Luis Garcia, who are asleep because it is in the middle of the night in Europe. So this is the Australasian Kant Group edition of the virtual Kant Congress. What we've typically done is hand it over to the local group, which has curated and organized and will host the session. The sessions tend to go for an hour and a half to 2 hours, after which time some people will stick around and have informal conversation without the recording. But for now, we are recording. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to the host of our session, Plato Say. Plato.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Z, for hosting the session for today. I'm Plato Tse. It's my pleasure to be the coordinator for the Asia Pacific group. And today we have 4 invited speakers. So first we'll have Eric Nelson, and then Melissa Merritt, and then Ken Hao Go, and then Cheng Hao Lin. So I will do a brief introduction and then I'll pass on to our speakers. Eric Nelson is Professor of Philosophy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He is the author of a number of books: Heidegger and Tao, Things, Nothingness, Freedom, published with Bloomsbury in 2023. Taoism and Environmental Philosophy, published with Routledge in 2020. Levinas, Adorno, and the Ethics of the Material Other, published with Sunny Press also in 2020, and Chinese and Buddhist Philosophy in Early 20th Century German Thoughts, published with Bloomsbury in 2017. And he has published numerous articles and book chapters on German, Chinese, and intercultural philosophy. He edited Interpreting Dilthey Critical Essays, published with Cambridge University Press in 2019. And co-edited 4 other volumes. And Melissa Merritt is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. She is the author of numerous articles and 2 books on Kant, which examine a range of areas of Kant's philosophy, including ethics and moral psychology, aesthetics and theory of the sublime, philosophical methodology, and the nature of rationality. Her book, Kant on Reflection and Virtue, published with Cambridge University Press, won the North America Kant Society Book Prize, and she received the Annette Bayer Prize from the Australasian Association of Philosophy for her paper, Kant and Stoic Affections, which was published in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy in 2021. Melissa Merritt held an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship from 2019 to 2022 for her project Reason, Value, and Virtue, Assessing the Stoic Legacy in Kantian Ethics. An edited collection from the project, Kant and Stoic Ethics, will be published with Cambridge University Press in early 2025. And she's currently completing a monograph as part of this project, tentatively titled Kant's Transformation of Stoic Philosophy. And our 3rd speaker today, Ken Hao Ko, is from Singapore, but he received his PhD in philosophy from Syracuse University, including a 1-year dissertation research stay at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. His research emphasis is on Fichte's early philosophy, and he has published numerous journal articles, book chapters, and a book on Fichte's theory of freedom earlier this year. And he just ended a visiting fellowship with the National University of Singapore and is currently working on a book on Fichte's aesthetic. And our 4th speaker today, Cheng Hao Lin, he is an assistant professor at National Tsinghua University. He graduated from the Department of Philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, with a dissertation focused on Kant's concept of the self. In recent years, his research has centered on the regulative function of ideas in Kant's transcendental dialectic and their role in cognition and perception. His latest research project attempts to explore the relationship between a priority, analyticity, and necessity in Kant's philosophy, aiming to distinguish different senses of necessity to explain the various judgments classified by Kant. Additionally, in the field of practical philosophy, he also studies the issue of the highest good and the relevance of Kant's thought to contemporary international relations. So without further ado, I'll pass the time to our first speaker today, Eric Nelson, and he will be speaking on the topic Kant's autonomy and formation, Bildung. So, Eric, when you are ready.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. As he mentioned, I work in intercultural philosophy, and my broader project here is actually on the Chinese reception of Kant, and in which education plays a really interesting role that is unusual maybe in Kant scholarship overall. But due to the limits of space, I'll focus more on Kant primarily here today. And the title is slightly different, Kant, Education and Self-Cultivation. So I want to explore the interplay between the broader notion of education as Erziehung and then cultivation, Kultivierung in Kant. So let's go into the details of the paper, and I'll just give you an outline of what I'm thinking about right now. And so, given the cosmopolitan purpose of this virtual Kant Congress, it might be well worth returning to questions of education and self-formation in Kant's lifelong reflections on these topics. In Kant's arguably still underappreciated lectures on pedagogy, originally published in 1803 by Friedrich Theodor Rinck, Kant stated the centrality of education and cultivation in striving towards progress, republican government, and a cosmopolitan condition. Indeed, even says education is that which makes humans genuinely human. So humans only become human with all of their natural propensity and natural seeds and natural capacities through education and, in fact, the social cultural condition, which he establishes throughout these lectures. But the crucial question for Kant throughout this series of lectures on education is how education, as a variety of coercion and discipline, can in fact stimulate a cultivation of freedom and how to use it well. He actually says, gut zu gebrauchen. So Kant and the question of building might seem odd to from a certain perspective, because there's been a lot of disinterest or misunderstanding of this topic. I think there are several reasons why we can state that Kant's philosophy of education and self-formation has not been sufficiently recognized so far. So if you look at histories of German pedagogy, Kant and other thinkers of the German Enlightenment are seen as thinkers of the education of the human species, of humanity, in Lessing's words, in contrast to the thick, socially, historically embodied notion of Bildung associated with German Romanticism, idealism, and in particular with Hegel. And we can even look at recent philosophers who are very sympathetic to Kant, who share this, I would call, prejudice. So this is evident, for example, in John McDowell in his work Mind and World, and in other writings where he talks about Hegel and Gadamer, where he calls for return to a more adequate recognition of the constitutive character of what he calls second nature, following the Hegelian tradition, and of Bildung, in which he contrasts Kant's overly individualistic and even anti-social notion of autonomy with the more mediated social thinking of Hegel and Gadamer. And of course, this is someone who is sympathetic to Kant's epistemology overall. But we see a number of counterexamples to this tendency, and one of them actually occurs in early 20th and mid 20th century Chinese philosophy, which is something I would like to talk about more in another context than here. But I just want to mention that Chinese liberals, and in particular, liberal New Confucian philosophers, recognized a certain kinship with Kant precisely as a philosopher of education and of self-cultivation. So a number of very well-known figures in their own time, at least, Zhang Junmai, Mo Tseng-san, and others, the so-called New Confucians, interpreted Kant not as a philosopher of abstract reason and morality, or of an overly asocial autonomy, but rather as one committed to the education and self-cultivation that forms, in fact, the social character of autonomy. Another factor we have to consider is that despite the common criticism or impression that Kant is overly individualistic in his notion of autonomy, It is clearly a different problem that we might face if we read the lectures on pedagogy and other essays such as What is Enlightenment more carefully. Because there we very obviously see that the primary form of education is not of the individual, but rather of the species, and then secondarily of society and of the public. And in What is Enlightenment, he's even very pessimistic about the possibilities of the individual even realizing enlightenment. And likewise, in the lectures on pedagogy, the individual comes third. And so the question really becomes then, how is individual education possible given this broader history of the species and society and so on? So let's turn now to this Enlightenment idea of the education of humanity, which he shares with Lessing, Mendelssohn, and other Enlightenment thinkers. So the education and cultivation of individuals largely depends on the former, or as stated in the pedagogy, the form of culture and civilization. So he actually introduces this thesis that our possibilities for education, self-formation, morally, culturally, socially, and so on, really depends on what we might call now the form of life. That a culture has to realize certain institutions and practices to even enable a certain kind of self-cultivation to occur. So there is then implicitly a historical dimension to Kant's analysis, and it focuses on a form of sociality as realizing not only culture at large, but individual possibilities of self-cultivation to live one way of life or another. So to be brief, as there is probably insufficient time here to discuss Kant's philosophy of history in detail, we'll just presuppose that categories such as social historical progress, enlightenment, are conditions of cultivating individual autonomy. But at the same time, in What is Enlightenment, for instance, he's the least optimistic about this possibility. So he says we can live in an enlightened age, but we cannot rely on each individual becoming enlightened. So what then is the dynamic? Well, basically it begins with the story of the natural seeds and inclinations and propensities and how they play out to educate the species despite itself. And then at a certain point, of course, we begin to more rationally self-determine what our political system, what our way of life should look like. So there's a transition from nature to history, so to speak. So even though he focuses on the history of the species, the education of the species, and the education of society and the public and so on, we can still recognize in Kant a sphere of individual self-cultivation as well. So perhaps we cannot realize enlightenment as individuals, but we can realize a certain moral condition, or at least strive towards it, according to many of his lectures on ethics and various other writings that I'll now turn to. So Kant discusses individual self-cultivation primarily in two different contexts. One is in the cultural context, which we see in the lectures on education, especially if we connect certain themes from it with the critique of judgment, which I'll do briefly just to give you a few examples. Then, of course, primarily with ethical self-cultivation, which is an important topic in his earlier pre-critical lectures on ethics, but still resonates in his later lectures as well. Cannot completely drop the question of how it is possible for a natural being to become a moral being. And thus he has a dimension that we might call second nature as well, but it is not a social historical condition per se, but rather a moral condition that we are striving to realize. So let's turn first to this cultural dimension. And I think it's interesting, and I've not seen many of the commentaries on the pedagogy mention this at length or in detail, that there are numerous passages, in fact, in Kant's lectures on pedagogy that are associated, of course, with his ethical writings, his political writings, but also there are a number of details that are interwoven with his passages on culture and the formation of culture and of community and the critique of the power of judgment. And due to time, I just want to focus on a few examples for us to think about here today. So first off, this notion of free play is crucial in the critique of the power of judgment. And in fact, the lectures on pedagogy is the other text that emphasizes how free play is part of the formation, education, and then the self-cultivation of individuals. So just as the free play and the harmony of the faculties are stressed throughout the third especially in the central part of the critique of aesthetic judgment, in the third critique, free play and the category of culture are seen as constituting the positive parts of physical and psychological education in the lectures on pedagogy, and they're seen as preventing the formation of a despotic condition of mere discipline and scholasticism. So a number of people are put off by Kant's focus on discipline in the lectures on pedagogy or in other such comments in the earlier lectures on ethics. But it's interesting that discipline is always set in relationship to the notion of freedom. And, and in this case, the notion of free play. That mere discipline, mere scholasticism, mere coercion can never realize a self-cultivated state, which aims not at mere memorization or repetition or copying, but rather at a condition of freedom. And so this paradox of how discipline can realize freedom occurs throughout the lectures on ethics, as well as the lectures on pedagogy, and really shapes this whole thinking of the whole enterprise of education. So free play then is a familiar category from the critique of judgment, but in the lectures on pedagogy, it is seen as being pleasant without a predetermined purpose. And we should be familiar with this idea from the critique of judgment that there can be purposiveness without a purpose. That is a free purposiveness that simply realizes itself, either through play or through art or through other activities. And here it is seen not simply in the aesthetic domain per se, it's not limited to the aesthetic, but it's seen more extensively across the whole array of cultural life. And free play then, in conjunction with a certain discipline and coercive discipline, is seen as being a condition of the formation of individual judgment and individual appreciation of both others and oneself in a cultural setting. So Kant says things such as it cultivates the faculties in their mutual relations, which of course is similar to the critique of judgment. And also he adds it forms a free culture. And I think this notion of free culture is really crucial and maybe not yet appreciated enough in Kant literature, because this notion of free culture, of course, is presented in the third critique, but also in the lectures on pedagogy. And in fact, this is the aim of education, not just to realize a cultured state in a despotic or mechanical or a scholastic or some other restrained sense, but rather a cultural state that is at the same time free. And in the lectures on pedagogy, he argues that the spontaneity basically learns in a sort of adaptive, free way, and thus becomes capable of not just obeying rules and maxims, but actually practicing them, enacting them, applying them in appropriate ways to different situations. So freedom then becomes a kind of capacity to have rules that can actually be employed in a sensible way in the world itself. And so we might say there's a dialectic of discipline and freedom, of obedience and play in how he's describing this formation of the child, who after the discipline of education, of learning and so on, has to develop a certain sense of freedom, and the freedom to put into their own use all of these capacities that they have developed through educational institutions, practices, and so on. So the point of education then is freedom. But there are two conditions in the lectures on pedagogy of education in how they form our possibilities of self-cultivation as individuals. So the first one is freedom. The second is self-reflection. So education and individual cultivation provide a link, I would argue, between the natural propensity between what Kant describes as a social or antisocial wild and raw spontaneity, which he says in the pedagogy is a natural propensity, Hang. So naturally we are inclined to freedom, but the freedom is chaotic and wild and unconcerned with others. And on the other end of the spectrum, a full notion of autonomy, which of course he links with maturity, but also that he sees as a form of sociality as well. So autonomy, of course, is not non-relational or non-social, as some critics of Kant seem to suggest, but rather can only be realized in a fully social condition. So this is realized. Freedom is realized not only through rules then, not only through the application of the rules through reason and understanding and so on, but in relationship to others in which we realize a certain form of respect and dignity of others. So how is that possible? So freedom is one condition, but the other condition, at least in the lectures on education, involves self-reflection. So such autonomy, he suggests there, requires this further moment. Culture is not simply communicated through concepts and regulations or even classics and exemplars. And this is another moment that the lectures on education share with the critique of judgment, because culture has to be seen in a different lens of how its dynamic actually unfolds. So it occurs through a learning that moves prior to concepts, regulations, classic exemplars, and in a sense can move through them to even unlearn them to gain new insights. So this involves what he calls the self-reflection of the subject in the lectures on education. So the other condition of the fulfillment of education is to become a self-reflective subject capable of moving through concepts, rules, regulations, exemplars, classics, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, this passage reflects that of the critique of judgment as well, where he argues that all of these instances of tradition can stimulate us, they can provoke us to further thought and so on, but we cannot simply rely on them in any mechanical or a scholastic way, but rather art requires something more than that. And just as art requires more than rules and examples, so too does education as well. And true learning means to learn not just what the example is, but what the example is rather pointing toward, the principle behind it, so to speak. So what this means then is that education aims at self-reflection, producing a more self-reflective subject, which in the end is up to the subject itself in a certain way. And this requires a kind of self-cultivation at the same time, self-sozium, because this cultivation ultimately requires individual self-reflection that then realizes itself through these practices of self-cultivation. So there is a close connection then between education and self-cultivations. And I would suggest then that the liberal new Confucian readings of the 20th century are not totally off the track when they see this kind of dimension operative in Kant's philosophy. Next, let's turn to the ethical dimension, which obviously has priority for Kant in a certain distinctive way. If we turn to his pre-critical lectures on ethics, they also address education and also the self-cultivation of what he initially calls moral feeling. So in the 1760s, he's closer to the moral feeling tradition. There are a number of passages where he talks about how to achieve and realize and clarify one's moral feelings to be a virtuous person. But it's interesting, even at that case, even in this case, the most important element is the realization of a certain kind of freedom. So, for example, there's an interesting discussion in the Herder copies of his lectures from the 1760s, where he says the most important thing is a discussion of religion and ethics, is not God's absolute decree, but rather the awakening of moral feeling through education. And likewise, he says the cultivation of moral feeling takes precedence over the cultivation of obedience. So the aim of moral education is to awaken these moral feelings at this point. But of course, he soon abandons this tendency towards moral feeling ethics and switches to the rational ethics of respect and dignity and so on, which still has an interesting relationship to moral feeling, of course, because there's a rational feeling of respect in his later ethical writings. But in terms of the idea of second nature, then, which McDowell and others have said is lacking in Kant, in fact, we do find an approximate notion of second nature, not in the historicist sense of Bildung in Hegel, perhaps, but in terms of ethics. So in the Collins lecture course version of the mid-1770s, he says, interestingly, we can indeed produce a habitus, which is not natural, though it replaces nature and becomes habitual through imitation and frequent exercise. And this sounds very much like a classical virtue ethical type of statement, but in fact, it is part of the education and practice of ethics to learn habits, to continue to act through habits, even though this is not the ultimate concern of ethical theory and ethical justification for Kant, it is not as if he completely eliminates this dimension of ethics, that it must involve practice, habituation, and so on. The real question is how Kant resituates these in a broader philosophical context that emphasizes our capacity to not simply follow habits and rules and so on, but rather reorient them in terms of our self-reflective capacities as subjects. And so again, I think the priority in Kant is on freedom, and freedom means ability to reorient our different moral tendencies that we have in place, potentially at least, even though we know it's probably not always likely in practice. So let's turn now to and bring this to a conclusion in a couple minutes, the critical context of Kant's notions of ethics and education and self-cultivation. So in Kant's critical ethics, Kant's earlier model of moral feeling has been displaced by the rational respect for persons and their autonomy and so on. And yet we can see that questions of the formation, education, cultivation of respect, for example, continues. It still becomes a question of how we become the moral agents we strive to be, how this practical reason can be embedded and embodied in our daily activities. So in the lectures on pedagogy, again, education and cultivation, he states, cannot directly teach a sense of dignity and law, insofar that they operate as the conditions of recognizing the moral worth of others. So they do not directly teach this because this is something that is self-initiated. The sense of moral worth, the sense of dignity has to be seen within oneself, and this is a condition of seeing it in others as well. But even though it cannot directly, positively, simply teach that, it can negatively and indirectly stimulate our recognition of our own moral worth and also the moral worth of others as well. So education then still serves a crucial function for Kant in that it makes the realization of our dignity, common dignity, possible. So these are realized then through the autonomy of, he talks about individual conscience in the lectures on pedagogy, that is self-realized ultimately through the education of spontaneity, through play and discipline, to the highest expressions of culture. So in the end, we realize through our own self-reflection, our own self-realization, through our own spontaneity that has been shaped through discipline, culture, play, and so on, to recognize not only our own worth and dignity, but that of others as well. And so here Kant is presenting us with a bridge between the more theoretical portrayal of practical reason and how practical reason could have a role in our practical sense of our moral worth and the moral worth of others. So there are these bridging moments in Kant that are very crucial, I think, to spell out his ethical theory, but also its implications in how we live. So if we turn then to the conclusion of the pedagogy, and I want to draw some conclusions here as well, we see a number of very interesting reflections that connect with his broader philosophy of history and political and moral philosophy, as well as the critique of judgment in a certain way. So, for example, he talks about how it is citizens who can freely adopt their laws and their maxims. So they have the self-reflective capacity that characterizes their freedom to reflect upon the law, the maxim, and then consider it how it is morally or practically necessary to adopt it, not only for themselves, but for others as well. So in the very last passages of the pedagogy, Kant stresses the gradually, bit by bit, growing consciousness of human equality and cosmopolitanism that results from this recognition of the respect of within human beings, of myself and others. And it's important to note that this is not only an abstract individualistic principle, again, for Kant, as some of his critics seem to suggest, as it is both a concrete task unfolded through social political life, where we gradually reshape our political life to have greater equality, greater cosmopolitanism, and so on. And as he stated in the very last paragraph, it involves the individual's daily self-reckoning, reckoning with oneself. So when it's called to reflect not just in the abstract, but to reflect on the course of one's activities on a day-by-day basis. And here again, he introduces this notion of a free culture. And I think it is crucial to see the connection between this notion of free culture and cosmopolitanism, where we have not just a free culture within one society, but across all human societies in their capacity to interact with each other on a basis of greater equality rather than mere inequality. And this is something that, very interestingly, in the very last passage, he contrasts with the narrow self-interestedness, the narrow vision of nationality. So this is a very early critique of nationalism, before nationalism became even very prevalent in German thought as it did in the next generation. So finally, I just have two further notes that these moments in Kant no doubt reminded modern liberal Confucian readers like Mo Tsung-san of the role of daily self-examination and the cultivation of both social and individual life. Autonomy is seen as a social, as having a fundamentally social character in our relation with others rather than just as an abstract, isolated freedom. And finally, I'd also like to say that reconsidering Kant's conception of education towards cultural and ethical social autonomy, the second nature of moral cultivation, and especially his notion of free culture, I think indicates ways of responding to critics of Kant, such as McDowell or McDowell's appeal to authors such as Hegel and Gadamer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, for the wonderful talk. For comments and questions, please mark them down and keep it in your mind for the moment, and we'll do a collective round of Q&A at the end. So let's move on to our second speaker today. Melissa Miritz will speak on the topic friendship and the Kantian ethical commonwealth. Lisa, when you're ready. Lisa, you need to switch on your microphone.
Still not working.
Yeah, it seems it's not working.
Should we change up the order while Melissa gets the microphone figured out?
About this, is that working?
Ah, yeah,
Yep,
now
that
it works.
That works. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. So I've wasted all this time, precious time. Is everybody seeing the screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So thanks, Eric, for that talk. That was really interesting, and some of it resonates. I think a lot of the core issues resonate with stuff I'm thinking about as well. Thank you for the introduction, Plato, and for including me here today, and to the organizers. I'm going to be talking about friendship and the Kantian ethical commonwealth. And this is an idea that comes up in the religion. And I just want to begin by saying, you know, the religion has quite a lot going on in it. And I'm just going to have to kind of get to where I want to get, just sort of say some stuff about how I understand that text. So the issue that, one issue that runs through a lot of the religion is what I think of as the developmental predicament of the human being. So I'm just going to give an overview of how I understand that predicament. Now, the premise of the argument of the religion, what we see right in the beginning, is that there's an original predisposition to good in human nature, which I will abbreviate OPG. And good in this context refers to the developmental completion of the human being, the essentially rational animal. And this telos is conventionally conceived as virtue. But it's to be emphasized that it is not a narrowly moral conception of the good that is at issue. Now, the OPG says that the human being is providentially endowed with a readiness to find fitting the actions and things that promote her developing to completion. According to the ensuing narrative, the human being inevitably corrupts this endowment from the first exercise of free choice. This is the radical evil that Kant attributes to human nature, not in the sense that it is writ into us in the way we are created, but rather in the sense that it is inevitably self-inflicted at a certain stage in our development. The radically evil human being with a corrupted OPG will now carry on in ways that lead her further and further away from that telos, which again is conventionally conceived as virtue, unless and until she overthrows radical evil in another act of free choice. To do this, Kant says, is to restore the original predisposition to good to its power. The overthrow of radical evil does not make one instantly good. It is not identical with the attainment of virtue. Rather, it makes one a progressor, someone, again, on the developmental path to good. So religion 3 opens with the radical evil overthrowing progressor taking a good look around and finding that no one can develop to good here. Apparently, it doesn't matter if there are a decent number of radical evil throwing progressors among us. Together, we sustain a world inimical to anyone's development to virtue. So the progressor's commitment to virtue cannot be sustained unless something is done. But what? Kant points to a duty of its own kind to establish an ethical commonwealth. The duty is not, and there are many ways in which this resonates with Stoic cosmopolitanism, which I will just barely touch on, but anyway. And the duty is not one that individuals have to other individuals, but one that the human species has to itself. That is why Kant says that it has its own principle as well. It is not something drawn directly from the moral law as the principle of a rational will as such, but one that stems from the developmental predicament of the human being. The ethical commonwealth would be a social order in which it is possible for the human being to develop to good. Kant says that this sublime idea is never fully realized or never fully attainable by human beings, but it is to be approximated in a yet to exist church. Now, 2 further observations must be made for me to home in on my topic. One is that Kant's conception of the ethical commonwealth is, in many respects, his reworking of Stoic cosmopolitanism, and that's a big topic unto itself, but it butts up against the issue that I want to consider here. The second further observation is that the ethical commonwealth is quite simply a rather strange and difficult idea. For it is evidently the duty to realize it is to be fulfilled by a group agent, if not, as in the sublime idea, the entire human species, then at any rate by a social group. Perhaps the difficult idea needs to be scaled down further. And so Alan Wood has suggested in a couple works, friendship. But Kant says church. Isn't friendship domesticating the idea too far? So that was kind of my initial resistance to his suggestion. But then I kind of worked on it in the context of this bigger project, and I discovered that there's something historically apt in the idea of friendship as a relevant approximation, particularly when we appreciate Kant's engagement with Stoic ethics in this context, and indeed his particular interest in Seneca. So my aim in just the few minutes I have is just to tell some of that story. So I'm going to begin with sort of Stoicism and Seneca's conception of friendship, and then Kant later. Okay, so the Stoic cosmopolis is a community of rational beings, gods and humans. And in Stoicism, it's supposed that this cosmopolis just exists. It doesn't need to be brought about by human effort. And in that respect, it surely differs from the Kantian ethical commonwealth. But the difference is not as stark as may initially seem, since the recognition of the cosmopolis should bear profoundly on human conduct and motivation. Stoics, relatedly, invoke civic duty. A wise person will take part in ordinary political and family life if nothing prevents him. Among the mitigating circumstances adduced by Seneca, himself an avowedly ambivalent power player in imperial Rome, is that the state may be too diseased to be helped. Thus, Seneca has an impulse to withdrawal, which he struggles to reconcile with the cosmopolitan demands of Stoic ethics. And his account of friendship is his effort to sort of address the difficulty. And so I can't say a whole story about this, but hopefully the rough idea will come out. Seneca often bemoans that the public sphere as we know it cannot be made fit for the promotion of the human good. He says, every single person urges some fault upon us, or imparts one to us, or contaminates us without our even realizing it. Relatedly, he suggests that we are living in a plague, where we cannot but contact disease from merely being breathed on. And this last image, to my ear, it just resonates with the way Kant sets out the problem in Religion 3, and in an expression that I find, sort of one of the most chilling of the entire corpus. He says, it is enough that they are there, that they surround him, and that they are human beings for them to corrupt each other's moral disposition and make each other bad. Seneca, at any rate, keeps telling us that we are swept along by the madding crowd, and our developmental mandate is to escape it. There's never any judging about life, he says, but always trusting. We are spun around and thrown headlong by hand-me-down error. We perish as a result of others' examples. We will be restored to health, only let us be segregated from the crowd. Evoking again the image of a thronging crowd in a letter to Lucilius, Seneca asks, how can we be recalled to health when all people drive us forward and no one holds us back? It's a plea for someone to hold him back, someone with whom to consider in the appropriately serious ways what matters, what is good, what is a reason for doing what, and what we make of ourselves by thinking and choosing and acting as we do. It is a plea for friendship. Cyrenus, Seneca's friend and interlocutor on Tranquility of Mind, speaks of the weakness of a good mind, his own, that follows me in every affair. And a special brand of flattery thrives among those who self-consciously take up this virtue-seeking way of life, he continues, one no less dangerous than that which greases the gears in the corrupt public sphere. So he says, who has dared to tell himself the truth? Who, though set among flocks of praising and wheedling fellows, has not flattered himself most of all? Cyrenus had opened with an expression of dismay. Some of my faults, he says, are openly displayed for me to take in hand, some less obvious and hidden, and yet others that were not constant but recurred at intervals. They jump out like enemies on the move. As the Stoic reply would go, it is because you do not know yourself that you seem to be besieged in this way. Cyrenus does not know himself, and he also knows as much. But won't another Stoic, committed progressive flatter him in the spirit of being encouraging? Seneca indicates that such a flatterer would not be a true friend. A friend is someone with whom one may speak completely openly, who may thereby show you who you are. Seneca's thought then is that a friend holds you back to engage in genuine judgment about life. She holds you back from the crowd where everything seems to be taken on trust, and what gets taken on trust are deeply confused views about what is worth going for and why. His thought is not just that we should be more reflective. We should take care with whom we reflect with, just as in a plague, he says, we should take care in selecting our nearest companions, those with whom we exchange the most air. For Seneca, then, friendship is a union of like-minded progressors. They agree on some conception of the goal, but may challenge one another on what constitutes progress towards it. The goal is virtue, the right reason of a sage. Seneca also says that friends share everything, and so they would also share the end of virtue. But what would that mean exactly? It helps to register that the question of what friendship is, and indeed whether Lucilius and Seneca are themselves friends, is contested throughout the letters. The letters are Seneca's letters to Lucilius. Seneca offers near the start of the letters an account of what friendship is. I can name you many people who have friends, but yet are without friendship. This is not the case, though, where equal willingness draws minds into a companionship of honorable intentions. So I'm going to just actually unpack the Latin a bit. So Seneca first indicates that he's distinguishing true friendship from the loose ways we speak of, having friends. And friendship, he says, happens when equal willingness draws minds into union or fellowship. So friends are of one mind. But how do we understand this? They join their wills into a union honesta capiendi. Cupiendi is a genitive singular gerundive, which means that it carries a sense of suitability or obligation, that is, something to be longed for or intended. Honestum is the standard or a standard Latin term for virtue. The form honesta, an accusative plural noun, gives the result that the union arises from proper longing for the virtues. Are Lucilius and Seneca friends? Letter 35 opens with Seneca's expression of the hope that they will be. Yet their correspondence broadly presupposes that each has the end of progressing towards virtue. And letter 34 opens with Seneca's exulting in the progress that Lucilius has made. He says, "You broke from the crowd a long time ago." So what is missing? It does not seem that it could be affection. As it is, he tells Lucilius, "You love me, but you are not my friend." Letter 34 makes clear that they are each ostensibly making progress, each supporting each other on the way. I am cheering for you in the race, and you in return are cheering for me. But they are not yet friends, apparently. Runners in a race are each performing tokens of the same action, running with the same end in mind. They may be cheering one another along, but they are not acting together, going after one single end. To be friends, they must be of one mind. It is a demanding conception of what it is to be of one mind. The things that friends do, they would do together. But what they are progressing towards is virtue. As friends, this can't mean my virtue or your virtue, Seneca's or Lucilius's, but must instead designate some kind of common good. Seneca never quite makes that last point explicit, but I think it is implicit in what he's saying. But Kant, at any rate, appears to have followed Seneca's thought to this conclusion and recoiled. So I'm going to turn now to Kant's discussion of friendship. There are sort of two main texts I'll be talking about. One is the Doctrine of Virtue and the Metaphysics of Morals, and the other is the 1793 lectures on record of Kant's lectures on ethics, the Vigilantius record. So, and these two texts overlap a lot in their ideas. So when he's discussing friendship in the Metaphysics of Morals, he focuses on what he refers to as moral friendship, a union of fallible people who are alike committed to developing towards virtue. So this is a union of mutual ethical promotion achieved through, he says, the complete confidence of two persons in revealing their secret judgments and feelings to one another, as far as such disclosures are consistent with mutual respect. So friendship figures as a kind of protection of from one's true thoughts being taken as a basis for judgment against one by those who don't have one's best interests at heart. So in that sense, it resonates with Seneca's conception of friendship as a kind of withdrawal from the corrupting public sphere, like people who would use your thoughts against you, when really you're just trying to sort of work out how to live and do this in the right way. But I'm going to focus on the Vigilantius record a bit more, because I think it sort of suggests a closer wrestling with Seneca's account of friendship. So there, Kant traces friendship to the general duty of love that we owe to every human being, that we must absolutely make it our maxim to promote the good in others. And he says explicitly that he's talking about promoting his improvement or the removal of faults. So what's at stake is the development of character and agency, in other words, not good as kind of some kind of physical well-being, merely physical well-being. Those who love one another in friendship, he says, must also be equals. This is also a theme that Seneca stresses, so that they may be fully united, each to the other, with no excess of favor on the one side in promoting the other's good. These features allow Kant to characterize friendship as, quote, the community of possession of one person by the other, or the reciprocal possession, that is the union of their person according to moral disposition. Such union, Kant suggests, creates a safe space for the mutual disclosure of thoughts. At this point, in both the Vigilantius lectures and the Doctrine of Virtue, Kant points to the developmental predicament of the human being as a creature naturally predisposed to human togetherness and is ultimately coming to require the comparative context of the social condition for the development of his powers of agency. Thus, the human being, simply acting in the developmentally appropriate ways, is inevitably sociable, but in an unsociable way. In the Vigilantius lectures, Kant emphasizes that we emulate one another in a social context, giving rise to rivalry, in which we may even hate one another's very virtues and feel an inner joy at viewing him with less respect. This is a quotation. We notice the other's failings more shrewdly than his merits in order to put him down. And this result, Kant concludes, is, quote, a side of human nature that has really become malignant, notwithstanding that the purpose of emulation really lay in inciting men to constant cultivation of greater perfection in themselves by comparison with others. In the Tugendlehre, Kant focuses on the simpler point that we are bound to cultivate friendship, fellowship through communication, and then bound to become anxious about how our self-exposures may then be used against us by unloving others. So in this quotation, he says, the human being is a being meant for society, although he is also an unsociable one. And in cultivating the social state, he feels strongly the need to reveal himself to others, even with no ulterior purpose. But on the other hand, hemmed in and cautioned by fear of the misuse others may make of his disclosing his thoughts, he finds himself constrained to lock up in himself a good part of his judgments, especially those about other people. So Kantian moral friendship, I think this suggests, creates kind of like a bubble around our unsociable social condition. It is a societas that, through the loving union of wills, allows for the open disclosure of one's own thoughts. And he says a friend has a duty to point out the other's faults to him, not to use them against him, but for the sake of his improvement. Such friendship allows for genuine judgment about life, rather than, as Seneca would say, taking everything on trust, or as Kant would say, carrying on in the expected ways, keeping one's inner disposition unexposed and unexamined. Thus, like Seneca, Kant conceives of friendship as a mutual possession of one person by the other in promotion of their development towards virtue. Yet he explicitly eschews the conclusion that, as I suggested above, is implicit in Seneca's account, namely that the two friends who aim at virtue together would possess that virtue in common too. So it's not my virtue and your virtue, it's our virtue. So he says here, this is in Vigilantius, or he's recorded as saying, the essential thing here is the idea that each has of the other, that one belongs to the other, and that they possess each other in respect of their whole moral disposition. And each mutually shares in every situation of the other, as if it were encountered by himself. And this indeed, by laws of moral freedom, though no commonality of resources or enjoyment of happiness is to be understood thereby. So here we find Kant taking an individualistic perspective on human virtue. As a perfection of will, it can only be held by or attributed to the individual. Kantian friends, it would seem, are like the two runners in Seneca's race. They may be cheering one another on, but they are not truly acting as one. Kantian friends then cannot really be of one mind. If they are, they would come into the resources of virtue, or at least of genuine progress together. So, this is what Kant seems to be denying. And then I think he's kind of losing his grip on the principles of moral friendship that he's invoked. So just my concluding thoughts, just very, what I'm kind of trying to suggest here is that there's some context in which Kant toys with the idea of progressive friendship as a kind of response to the problem broached at the beginning of Religion 3. And so the solution is this dyadic social order united towards the end of virtue. But he doesn't really, when he's sort of thinking, when he's working out this idea in the context of Religion 3, it's not the friendship metaphor that he doesn't say we should approximate it as friendship. We should approximate it as a church. A church is it's not a dyadic union of two. I don't think on any conception. Maybe I'm wrong. But at any rate, the idea that he's actually trying to run in the religion is this idea that the ethical commonwealth would actually have, there is a kind of virtue of the ethical commonwealth. And this, I find it just a really deeply puzzling idea. Like, how do we understand that, given that virtue is a kind of attitude of mind, so there's a common mind that has an attitude, and they're really interesting, fascinating things to think about there. Not unfortunately something I can go into right now, but it's this idea. One reason why the virtue friendship idea might be helpful here is it might, that we can sort of, it does approximate the idea in ways that we can get our heads around, to think about what it would be for there to be kind of one virtue, not my virtue or your virtue, in certain kinds of friendships. And then maybe we can sort of use that to get our heads around the idea of one virtue in certain communities, maybe certain kinds of churches, as Kant thinks of that. Okay, thank you. I hope I didn't go on too long. And I need to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the wonderful talk. Let us move on to our third speaker today. Kant Hao, your topic will be on Kant's aesthetic of feeling. So it's your turn.
Yeah. May I just share my Microsoft Word file?
Yes, please.
I may. So I just share my screen with everyone. So I'll just read what I've written out on Microsoft Word. How is it?
It's not sharing.
Not sharing. Okay, then I'll just read. I'll just read out what I've written. Okay. So my topic is going to be on in what I shall call intellectual pleasure. The question I would like to consider is, does Kant have a notion of pleasures in the true, alongside pleasures in the agreeable, in the beautiful, the sublime, and the good? If so, do pleasures in the true fall within the scope of his critique of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure? That is to say, under the domain of the a priori principle of purposiveness. By a pleasure in the true, I mean satisfaction. Most of us would admit to experiencing when we engage in inquiries of a scientific sort, such as those in the natural and human sciences, as well as in logic and mathematics. Can you guys hear me? Fine, right, that's good. Assume for the moment that there is such a thing for Kant as a pleasure in the true. Presumably, such a pleasure would be one that accompanies a judging of the true, a judgment which is logical rather than aesthetic. To be clear, just because a judgment is not in itself aesthetic, it doesn't mean that it can have no aesthetic import. A judgment has an aesthetic import just as long as it stands in some relationship to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. Pleasure, as Zuckert argues, can have different contents and has no content specifically of its own, except that whatever it is we are experiencing, we want that same thing to continue. Defined by the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, the scope of significance of the aesthetic is not confined to what pertains narrowly to the beautiful, or even to the beautiful and the sublime. Just as Kant considered judging of the agreeable to be an aesthetic pathological judgment, and judging of the good to be an aesthetic practical judgment. We might also consider judging of the true to be an aesthetic logical judgment. Correspondingly, just as Kant describes the pleasure which accompanies an aesthetic pathological judgment as a pathologically conditioned satisfaction, and that which accompanies an aesthetic practical judgment as an pure practical satisfaction, we might describe the pleasure which accompanies an aesthetic logical judgment as a pure intellectual satisfaction. Such an attempt to spell out a Kantian account of pleasure in the true is vulnerable to at least three objections. First, it will be objected that Kant has no substantive, but only a nominal definition of truth. He famously concedes in the transcendental logic of the first critique that truth can be defined as the agreement of cognition with its object, but denies that this definition offers a criterion for truth that is valid of all cognitions without any distinction among their objects. Given that he has no substantive notion of what the true is, it might be argued that he can have no notion of pleasure in it either. In response, I will note that what Kant means by a nominal definition of truth here is not that the definition offers no substantive insight into the nature of truth, but that the insight is not enough to serve as a criterion for any particular kind of truth. By his own account, the definition offers a negative conditional sine qua non for any cognition to be true. By proposing to isolate the pleasures which accompany our judging of the true as a class for special consideration, I do not assume that judgments of the true or the pleasures which accompany them are all of the same kind. What I do assume is that judgments of the true are of a different kind from judgments of the agreeable, of the beautiful, of the sublime, and of the good. An assumption about which there is nothing unusually controversial. A second objection is that for Kant, the pleasure that comes with scientific investigations and discoveries of what is true is not of a distinctive kind. That the enthusiasm, keenness, joy, and revel that we feel in the course of our scholarly and research activities are reducible wholesale to sensual pleasure in the agreeable. Kant seems to suggest this when he remarks in the first introduction of the third critique that the concept of perfection as objective purposiveness has nothing at all to do with the feeling of pleasure, and the latter has nothing to do with the former. However, this does not square with an observation he makes elsewhere in paragraph 53 or section 53. No, in section 54, Kant alleges that Epicurus, the ancient Greek hedonist, mistakes an intellectual and even practical satisfaction for gratification. This suggests that he has some concept of, or at least some notion of, an intellectual pleasure that is distinct not only from sensual pleasure, but also from, though somewhat akin to practical pleasure. According to him, this type of pleasure is better characterized in terms of approval and disapproval, Billigung or the Missbilligung, rather than of gratification and pain, Vergnügen and Schmerz. Unfortunately, besides this one passing mention, there is virtually no elaboration, not to mention a sustained and systematic discussion of intellectual pleasure in the text. What we do have instead is a considerably nuanced and sophisticated account of feelings that are combined with logical judgments of formal objective purposiveness. A third objection is that what I call intellectual pleasure in the true is really explicable for Kant in terms of, and hence reducible to a kind of aesthetic pleasure in the beautiful. One might pursue this approach by investigating Kant's claim in the introduction that the groundless and contingent aptness we find in the order and arrangement of natural things for our cognitive needs and capacities evokes a very noticeable pleasure that is akin to the pleasure we take in a beautiful. Or another approach is to look at his concept of adherent beauty. There is no doubt much to be said about these approaches, but given the time constraint, I will forego the opportunity and note simply that intellectual pleasure must, if it is to be a pleasure in the true, accompany judgments which are based upon a concept of the kind of thing its object is supposed to be. Insofar as a judgment of taste can be based for Kant upon no such concept, intellectual pleasures must be thought of as picking out a separate and distinct class of pleasures from aesthetic pleasures. A judging of the true is a judging of a purposiveness that is with a purpose. What I have dubbed an aesthetic logical judgment, hyphen logical judgment, is a judgment that has the concept of a determinate purpose for its determining ground. As such, a logical judging is a judging of what Kant terms objective purposiveness. Kant's concept of objective purposiveness is complicated but central to his conception of logical judgments. To tease out his view of the pleasure that accompanies logical judgments, it is worth clarifying the concept. Objective purposiveness can be either external or internal on the one side, and can be intellectual or practical on the other. The purposiveness of an object is internal when it presupposes the concept of a purpose that contains the ground of the object's internal possibility. That is to say, of the kind of thing the object is supposed to be. It is external when it presupposes no such concept. On the other hand, objective purposiveness is practical when it relates to the purpose of a will activity. But purposiveness need not entail motivation and action. As Kant clarifies in the introduction, the purpose in question need not always be a practical purpose, which presupposes or includes a pleasure in the existence of the object. But it can also belong to technique and thus concerns merely the possibility of things. Objective purposiveness is intellectual when it relates to the essence of a thing or the kind of thing it is. These possibilities yield the four possible combinations of 1. An external practical purposiveness or utility, or the goodness of what is good for something else. 2. An internal practical purposiveness, that is morality, or the goodness of what is good for itself. 3. An external intellectual purposiveness, or relative purposiveness of nature. And lastly, 4. An internal intellectual purposiveness, or the internal purposiveness of nature. Also, Kant is accustomed to speaking of the perfection of a thing, by which he means the thing's internal purposiveness. Given that internal purposiveness can be either practical or intellectual, Kant has presumably a moral as well as a logical concept of perfection. In section 62, Kant further distinguishes between a formal and a real intellectual objective purposiveness. He is painstakingly aware of the remarkable affinity of formal objective purposiveness of geometrical figures to an aesthetic subjective purposiveness of beautiful things. He describes it as a purposiveness that is not grounded in a purpose for which teleology would be necessary, but only in general. he cannot be taken to be saying here that formal objective purposiveness is a purposiveness without a purpose. For he tells us in section 15 that to represent a formal objective purposiveness without a purpose is a veritable contradiction. So I take him to mean that it is a purposiveness with a purpose only in general, in the sense that it is a merely formal unity of the a priori principle that determines the way in which existing things are given to us, rather than the real unity of any existing thing. By contrast, a real intellectual objective purposiveness will be a purposiveness that has its ground in the real unity of some existing thing. For all its affinity to an aesthetic judging of formal subjective purposiveness, the logical judging of formal objective purposiveness presupposes the concept of a purpose and is not to this extent to be conflated with aesthetic judging. It is in the context of his discussion of formal objective purposiveness in section 62 that Kant provides his most elaborate account of the feeling, which is combined with a judging of the true. But I think the account can be extrapolated to the perception of the real objective purposiveness of natural things. As noted, Kant sees a formal objective purposiveness of geometrical figures as coming remarkably close to the formal subjective purposiveness of beautiful things. It is no surprise then that the mathematically true should arouse a feeling for him, analogous to the feeling for the beautiful. Kant observes of ancient geometers that they delighted in a purposiveness in the essence of things. I'm quoting here, delighted in a purposiveness in the essence of things which they could yet present, darstellen, present in its necessity, fully a priori. He accounts for the feelings that are combined with their aesthetic logical judgments as follows. Quoting again, now astonishment or wonder, Verwunderung, is a mental shock at the incompatibility of a representation and the rule that is given through it with the principles already grounded in the mind, which thus produces a doubt as to whether one has seen or judged correctly. But admiration or marvel, Bewunderung, is a wonder that continually recurs despite the disappearance of this doubt. End of quote. What does Kant mean by the incompatibility of a representation and a rule given through it and the principles already grounded in the mind? Sticking with his example of the geometrical truths about a circle, what arouses the feeling of marvel is the unity, harmony, or purposiveness which is perceived in the essence of a circle. This can be thought of as a set of rules which are synthetic and therefore cannot be passed from the concept of a circle, but only given in an intuition of the same. But in constructing an intuition or a schematic presentation elsewhere, he speaks of the schematic presentation of a circle, I cannot help but create the illusion that the figure's unity possesses empirically an external ground distinct from my power of representation for its rules. However, the truth of the matter is that I introduce the purposiveness into the figure that I draw in accord with a concept. In my own way, that is, in my own way of representing that which is given to me externally, whatever it may be in itself. Most interestingly, this truth of the matter, right, That is, the priority of the figure's purposiveness is not unknown to me. My representation of the circle can, Kant writes, nevertheless be cognized by me a priori as truthful. As I understand Kant, it is the discrepancy between the appearance that the purposiveness of the figure has an empirical ground in something given to me from the outside, and the reality that it is not a property outside of me, but merely a kind of representation in me that gives rise to the mental shock of wonder. A continuance of doubt and its removal, the overall vacillation between doubt and certainty constitutes the feeling of marvel. Kant claims of marvel that it is an entirely natural effect of that purposiveness observed in the essence of things bracket as appearances, thus indicating that this feeling accompanies not only the pure cognition of mathematical entities, but also the empirical cognition of natural things. The agreement of these cognitions with their object, in other words, their truths, is not only inexplicable to us, insofar as it is precisely thus and not otherwise, but also enlarges the mind, allowing it, as it were, to suspect something lying beyond those sensible representations, in which, although unknown to us, the ultimate ground of the accord could be found. Lastly, I would like to consider the potential issues which an admission of a special class of intellectual pleasures could raise for Kant's typology of pleasures in the critique of the aesthetic power of judgment. Pure intellectual satisfaction is peculiar on its face in being strikingly like pure aesthetic satisfaction, and unlike pathologically conditioned and pure practical satisfaction in being disinterested and free. Correspondingly, aesthetic logical judgments are strikingly like pure aesthetic judgments, and unlike aesthetic pathological and aesthetic practical judgments in being merely contemplative. This is so despite the fact that pure intellectual satisfaction is unlike pure aesthetic satisfaction in being objectively purposive. And aesthetic logical judgments are unlike pure aesthetic judgments in having a concept of its object for its ground, a universality that is objective, and a necessity that is unconditioned by common sense, but demonstrable. This peculiarity of intellectual pleasure seems to call for a revision of Kant's well-known tripartite division of pleasures into sensual pleasures in the agreeable, aesthetic pleasures in the beautiful, and practical pleasures in the good. Rachel Zuckert, Z-U-C-K-E-R-T, Rachel Zuckert has relied on the tripartite division of pleasures to make a compelling case for the thesis that aesthetic pleasures in the beautiful are for Kant constitutive and paradigmatic of pleasure. This is found particularly in an article of hers, a 2002 article, A New Look at Kant's Theory of Pleasure. That's the title of the article. In view of the peculiar affinity of intellectual to aesthetic pleasures, the question arises as to whether the case might still stand. As one who is sympathetic to Zuckert's interpretation, I will argue that aesthetic pleasures are indeed representative of pleasure as such. What the possibility of intellectual pleasures makes clear is that aesthetic pleasures are representative of pleasure as such, not because they are disinterested and free, or that they are unrelated to the faculty of desire, but because they are, as Zuckert herself has pointed out, not mediated by any objective representation. But first, very briefly and very simplistically, Zuckert's argument is this. Kant sees pleasure as being intrinsically motivational and future-directed in the sense that it refers to a future state that causes the present state to take one path over another. The future-directedness of pleasure generates a problem for Kant's unidirectional view of causality, according to which something is caused by what precedes it and never by what succeeds it. In other words, something is always caused by the past and never by the future. In the case of sensory pleasures, in the case of sensual pleasures in the agreeable and practical pleasures in the good, the problem of backward causality is resolved by explicating their future directedness in terms of the purposive ideal causality of a concept having or willing agent, in which the future directedness of pleasure is, in her word, domesticated by having the anticipated object placed in a concept of the past and the present. The same, however, cannot be said about the future directedness of aesthetic pleasures, in the beautiful, which Kant construes as the consciousness of a representing as exciting no other desire than that it itself continue. Therefore, aesthetic pleasures warrant the postulation of an a priori principle of its own for a future directedness that cannot be reduced to that of a purposive ideal causality of a concept having or willing agent. To be clear, Kant himself distinguishes the agreeable and the good from the beautiful by the fact that they both have a relation to the faculty of desire. He regards satisfaction in both as being combined with interest, that is, as arising specifically from the representation of the existence of an object, and infers from this, with no further premise, that such a satisfaction always has, at the same time, a relation to the faculty of desire. Taking cue from Kant, Zuckert naturally explains that sensual and practical pleasures require no a priori principle because they can be incorporated into the model of practical activity in a way aesthetic pleasures cannot be. Their future directedness cannot be captured by, quoting her, captured by conceptualized intentions, by purposes, properly speaking, for will activities. Will activity here referring no doubt to full-bodied practical actions, which are functions of the faculty of desire, as opposed to the faculty of cognition. Assuming that there's such a thing as intellectual pleasure, it seems that we can maintain the putative paradigmatic status of aesthetic pleasure only either by denying that intellectual pleasures are free and disinterested in the sense in which aesthetic pleasures are intended by Kant to be, or by denying that it is by virtue of its being disinterested and free that aesthetic pleasure is paradigmatic of pleasure. One might be drawn to the former approach if one assumes that Kant means by aesthetic pleasures being free, that they are not subject to the rules of any concept. But a careful reading of the text will show that this is not what he means at all. Rather, he means that they are free from being extorted by the interests of either the senses or reason. In other words, he has in mind a freedom from bias, from being bent to favor one side of an issue or another. In other words, an indifference to either side. As far as I can see, aesthetic pleasures are disinterested and free and unrelated to the faculty of desire in just the sense we take intellectual pleasures to be. If they are to be constitutive and paradigmatic of pleasure, they must be so for some reason other than their being disinterested and free and unrelated to the faculty of desire. In this connection, it will be observed that the concept ascribed to a purposive ideal causality by which Zuckett proposes to resolve the problem of backward causality might just as well be the concept of an intellectual as the concept of a practical purpose. As Zuckett explains it, conceptual insight is unproblematic not because it is practical, but because concepts are universal rules, which in principle apply to any present or past or future. The practical nature of sensual and practical pleasures carries no weight at all in her account of why they do not require an a priori principle of their own. If it is not because it is disinterested and free and unrelated to the faculty of desire, but because it is a purposiveness without a purpose, that aesthetic pleasure is paradigmatic of pleasure, then we might readily explain why intellectual pleasure cannot, despite its being disinterested and free and unrelated to the faculty of desire, be said to be representative of pleasure as such, in the way aesthetic pleasure can be said to be. It is the third moment, and not, as one might imagine, the first moment of the judgment of taste that does the work in distinguishing aesthetic pleasures as representative of pleasure as such. That's all. That's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken Hao, for the stimulating presentation. Let's move on to our fourth speaker today, Chen Hao Lin.
Okay, thank you. I share my PowerPoint.
Yes, please.
So can you see my PowerPoint? It's clear? Okay.
Yep, it's working.
Okay. Okay, so firstly, thank you to organizer for organizing this event, and thank you also to Plato for hosting and the introduction. And I'm sorry that I have no image because when I open my camera, my Zoom would crash. But I hope my voice is clear and you can see my PowerPoint. And my topic is the regulative role and the cognitive contribution of reason in Kant's appendix to transcendental dialectic. So as we know, reason is the third main cognitive faculty Kant deals with in the first critique. And in Kant's analysis of the transcendental dialectic, reason seems to have no contribution to the constitution of cognition. The worst is that it misleads us into illusions and dialectic inferences. However, in the appendix to the transcendental dialectic, Kant also claims everything grounded in the nature of our powers must be purposive and consistent with their correct use if only we can guard against a certain misunderstanding and find out their proper direction. Quote end. At the end of dialectic, Kant tries to show us that reason also positively contributes to cognition. Therefore, its products, namely ideas, have objective validity as well. And this means Kant wants to acknowledge the positive role of reason in the theoretical domain, and it is likewise requires a transcendental deduction of the ideas of reason. So my main questions, however, in the appendix, Kant's structure of argument is not distinct. My main objective in this paper is to make the cognitive contribution of reason prominent and reconstruct the transcendental deduction of the ideas of reason that appear only vaguely in the appendix to the dialectic. And in this paper, I want to answer three main questions. First, what is the content of the highest transcendental principle of reason? It is supposedly parallel to the principle of perception in understanding. And so this principle Kant proves that the ideas are somehow the conditions of the possibility of objects of cognition. And second, what is the difference between the objective validity of concept reason and that of understanding? If a difference is not made, it would seem to contradict Kant's distinction between the analytics as the logic of truth and the dialectic as the logic of illusion, and the principle of the former as constitutive and that of the later as regulative. Third, the answer to the second question refers to another question of interpretation of this appendix. It is whether the necessity of the ideas is merely for an additional conditional purpose or a limited specific scope of cognition, or whether they are significant and even necessary in a strict sense for our own cognition in general. This the main questions I want to deal with in this paper. So let's look at my outline. So in this paper, I focus on the first part of the appendix on the regulative use of ideas of pure reason to answer these questions. After reviewing and evaluating the discussion in the secondary literature on this issue in the second section, but second section I will skip second section to save time. I will compare this appendix with the analytic to transcendental analytic to obtain some hints for interpretation and reconstruction in the third section. Then we can expect that there are also parallel parts of the analytic of concept and analytic of principle in this appendix for the ideas, especially their deduction and the schematism. And in the fourth section, I will show that we can imitate the deduction of the categories to start the deduction of the ideas of reason with the highest principle of reason. It is the principle of systematic unity. And then point out that this principle presupposes the synthesis of the ideas of reason. And in the fifth section, I will argue that the principle of systematic unity does not only help us to organize our cognition more systematically, but all cognition must presuppose it to obtain a criterion of truth. And in the sixth session, I will point out that the difference in the objective validity between the categories and the ideas lies in the fact that the categories are necessary for the constitution of knowledge, but that the ideas are required for the cognitive process to obtain knowledge. This is the difference between constitutive use and regulative use. And in the last section, this section I will also skip to save time. The whole structure is too long. But I can talk about that here. In the last session, I will explain how the ideas can be the analog of the schema to mediate the principle of systematic unity and our normal cognition. So this analysis we can conclude that reason has its important cognitive contribution in the theoretical realm. It has not only an additional function for reason to satisfy its interests, but it is also necessary for our ordinary cognitive life, but on a different level and in different sense compared to the necessity of understanding. This is the whole structure of my paper, but I will in this presentation I will only focus on this 4 point. Okay, so we come to the first point, the structure of the appendix to dialectic. This appendix is divided into on the regulative use of the ideas of pure reason, and the second part named on the final aim of the nature dialectic of human reason. And the first part discusses the fundamental character of the principle and the ideas of reason in general. It has its regulative use of systematic unity, and the second part shows one by one how the specific transcendental ideas bring their use into full play. It can be compared with the structure of the transcendental analytic. Transcendental analytic is divided into analytic of concept and analytic of principles. The former also focuses on the fundamental elements of understanding and whether they have objective validity. The latter deals with these elements, concrete contribution and achievement in our empirical cognitions. This is similar to the 2 parts of the appendix to the dialectic. I will interpret the appendix of the dialectic according to this analogy. So actually there can we can find further more detailed contrast between the 2 section between transcendental analytic and transcendental dialectic, but I don't want to go into detail. So we go to the next point, but you can just look at this contrast. Okay, then we come to my main discussion, the deduction of the ideas. Let's first see if ideas can be analogized to the categories having an a priori proof. In the deduction of the categories, Kant has established the principle of any transcendental deduction. The only way to prove the objective validity of the concept a priori, it is their applicability to the empirical objects, is to prove that they are the conditions of the possible experience in some sense. However, in the main part of the dialectic, Kant has shown that the ideas have nothing to do with the experience and therefore have no objective validity. Then how can they at the same time be the conditions of the experience? Kant's strategy is to assign them an indirect relation to experience. It is that they are the conditions of the uses of understanding in some sense, and in this sense, they are at the same time the indirect conditions of the experience. And here Kant sees the cognition of understanding as a manifold as well that needs to be united under higher unity, a collective one that the understanding by itself cannot provide. The transcendental deduction, and we can see in transcendental analytic, the transcendental deduction begins with the highest principle, namely the principle of transcendental apperception. Likewise, I think we can expect that Kant's deduction of the idea of reason begins with highest principle as well. Then what is this principle of reason that can determine all our cognition of understanding? And why is the highest the unity of reason in contrast to the cognitions of understanding? I think for Kant, it is the principle of systematic in cognition. Kant claims here that the reason seeks to determine all of our cognition of understanding with systematic unity. So the next step of then back to the deduction of categories. The next step of the B deduction after the statement of the principle of perception is to point out that this principle implies a synthesis of the representations. Set side by side, the systematic unity implies a synthesis of our all cognition of understanding. Otherwise, there would be no systematic unity among them at all. Besides, the cognition of the understanding cannot combine with each other by themselves. So they need the concept of the whole that are not among the concept of understanding. It is the ideas of reason. Accordingly, only through ideas the cognition of the understanding can find a place in the whole. So until now, we have seen that the deduction of ideas and the categories share a similar argumentation structure, and we can thereby conceive how the objective validity of the basis is proved. But this explanation is not strong enough yet. There are at least still three complexities in this deduction. First, is the premise of this deduction plausible? Why do our cognition or understanding need systematic unity? And second, what kind of validity of this deduction is in contrast to the validity of the deduction of the categories? If there's no difference, then why could the use of reason not be constitutive for our cognition as well? And third, how do the ideas function about bringing systematic unity into the cognition of understanding? So in the next sections, we will deal with this question in sequence. Then first question, the possibility of the principle of systematic unity. So Kant does not tell us yet why all of our cognition of understanding should presuppose systematic unity. Would there be any problem if there was no thoroughgoing combination between our cognition of understanding? If we have no problem with our cognition of understanding that are not ordered by a system, then we cannot see why the ideas of reason are necessary for them. Kant's answer to this would be the cognition without a system do not work. The reason is that we need the systematic of the knowledge to obtain a criterion of truth. So you can see the quotation, but I don't read it. So how can we understand this connection? I believe the need of systematic unity has already appeared in Kant's discussion on the use of understanding. Okay. So we can see that Kant has emphasized in the postulates of empirical thinking in general, in the analytical principle, that our actual cognition consists not only in perception but also in the general roles of experience. And perception is important for Kant's theory of cognition, which relates our cognition with real objects. But according to Kant, it cannot be the only element to accomplish this because our given perception cannot cover all cognizable objects and even whole dimensions of a single object. Our cognition based on given perception would still be devised and it would not be able to form a meaningful whole pictures. even when a part of land had been organized by the categories. To form meaningful cognition within all our perceptions, we should even be able to judge the objects that we do not perceive. For this purpose, we need to employ empirical laws, especially those based on the law of causality. For example, when we stand outside and see the ground getting wet, we can, through the empirical law of causality, infer that it probably rains, even if we didn't perceive the rain. Otherwise, we would not be able to make sense of the earlier dry ground and the later wet ground. And therefore, the aggregate of this phenomena would be nonsense. However, this is still not enough for a complete combination of all perceptions. The law of causality can only help us take one step beyond the given perceptions. It can only connect every given phenomena of change with a cause, but there are still various perceptions that cannot constitute a phenomena of change and seem to have no relation to each other in our cognition. If this given perception do not have any relation, we cannot hold that they belong to a single experience, because the use of understanding must be based on at least partly the given perceptions. It cannot give all perception a thoroughgoing combination that could not also be learned from experience. This means that understanding alone cannot eliminate the possibility of multiple and separate experiences coexisting in our cognition. The different experience represent just the different worlds that are constituted by different isolated combination of representations. Kant writes in his work, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, quote, if different people have each of them their world, then we may suppose that they are dreaming, quote, end. If the different experiences in our cognition are allowed to coexist, and I mean separately coexist, then we cannot distinguish the truth from falsehood, illusion, and a dream anymore. This is because we can easily see the groundless, even contradictory phenomena as representing the different worlds and being contrary to each other. Only when we presuppose a systematic unity in experience, we can recognize the truth in distinction from dreams through the coherency of a single experience, whose contents are subject to the same empirical laws. Even the content of illusions includes the perceptions, and only in a single experience in which all perceptions stand in a necessary relation to each other, we can distinguish the truth from the falsehood in the perceptions. So due to this, Kant cannot but give us the picture of nature as a whole in the transcendental analytic to explain the possibility of cognition. And this concept requires already the aforementioned hypothetical use of reason. I believe the concept of nature is already beyond the field of the understanding. So what is also an idea? The understanding alone cannot give us a nature, because we cannot perceive nature as a whole on which the use of the understanding must be based. As we have seen, the concept of nature requires a hypothesis of necessary relation between all its elements. This presupposes the maximization of the normal empirical laws based on the understanding. It has to extend them to the world as a whole, and only reason can provide this necessity through its principle of systematic unity. So now returning to the appendix, we can understand why Kant says the systematic unity is the criterion of truth. For Kant, The criteria of truth is the coherency between the cognitions of understanding in a single experience. And this would be inconceivable if we do not presuppose the systematic unity of the experience. So we come to the next question. What's the difference between the objective validity of the ideas and the objective validity of the categories? We have seen that what the main argument of the deduction of the ideas of reason in general looks like, but it seems that the efficacy of this deduction is more than we expect. If our reconstruction of the deduction, if our reconstruction of the deduction of the ideas of reason in the last section is successful, the positive use of the idea does not consist in that the lay function as that make our cognition of understanding more systematic, but in that even the establishment of the cognitions of understanding must, in general, already presuppose them to obtain the truth in contrast to illusion and the dreams. Then how do we evaluate the contribution of the ideas of reason to our cognition in distinction from the contribution of the categories? Are they not both the possible conditions of the possible experience and share the same necessity to our cognitions? To resolve this problem, we should research in more depth what the hypothetical use of reason means. Firstly, we can see Kant distinguishes the apodict from the hypothetical use of reason. In the case of the former, a certain universal is already given, and this happens in the normal logical use of the reason. But in the case of the later, the universal is not given, but only assumed, and thus problematic. However, this assumed universal can give all given particulars a combination that all particulars, including those not given, can be seen as derived from this universal. So as we have shown, the universals in the hypothetical use are the ideas of reason. According to the deduction, they are necessary concepts for our cognition, but they are at the same time still problematic concepts. This means that it is uncertain whether they have the corresponding objects. This leads to the different statuses between the categories and the ideas in our cognition. It has difference between the constitutive concepts and the regulative concepts. The essential difference between the constitutive concept and the regulative concept consists in that the former is within the cognitions, but the later is without the cognition. This means the categories belong to the concept of cognition, but the ideas do not. For example, when we use the category of causality in our experience, we cognize some empirical causes and effects. However, when we use the idea of a world or a God or some other ideas, we do not mean to cognize the object of a world or God. Instead, we refer to a connection of all our cognitions as if they were in a single world or created by a God, which led us to find some concrete empirical connections between them. The regulative concepts are not elements with which we can build our cognition. They rather serve as guiding rules with which we can find the real connections between particular cognitions. They do not determine the structure of cognition, but the procedure to cognize, just a guide to bring a thoroughgoing connection among our all cognitions. In this sense, we can say that concerning the necessity of the contributions to cognition, the statuses of the categories and the ideas are the same, we necessarily have to use them to accomplish our cognition. But since they are different in the characters of the concept by themselves, the categories have the corresponding object in cognition, but the ideas have not. And the original principle of the systematic unity of reason appears as a subjective, logical principle that only reflects the interests of the reason. But the use of it has already implied the assumption of this systematic unity among real cognition. In this sense, it has turned into a transcendental principle. Thus, the logical and the transcendental principle are only two sides of the same principle of reason. This is my interpretation. And their difference does not lie in the determination of the principle, but only in different consideration. The principle of the systematic unity considered in itself is logic, but considered in its use, its application in nature, then it will be transcendental. But we need to notice that this principle of reason is different from the transcendental principle of understanding, namely the principle of apperception. Insofar as the later structures the basic form of our cognition, but the former only assume a combination points outside of our cognition. They are transcendental in different sense. The difference lies between the constitutive contribution and a regulative contribution to our cognition of objects. So then there are some sections that I skipped. So we directly come to the conclusion. So my conclusion in this paper are we can observe a similar structure between the analytic and the appendix to the transcendental dialectic. And second, the first principle of deduction of the idea is the principle of systematic unity. And the principle of systematic unity is necessary to establish the criterion for determining the truth of understanding's cognitions. And nevertheless, their objective validity are different. The ideas possess a regulative character in that they are necessary for our cognition, but are not inherent to them, like the categories. And the ideas can function as schemas by mediating the principle of systematic unity in the experience. This part I have no time to present. And I think there are still remaining questions that I don't resolve yet. Then, as we know, in the first part of the appendix, Kant doesn't precisely or explicitly refers to the so-called transcendental ideas, namely God, a soul, and the world. Just talk about ideas in general. So what do the ideas in the first part of the appendix refer is not so clear. And what are their relation to the so-called transcendental ideas in strict sense? This is also need to investigate. And another question is some ideas like the idea of God that appear in the second part of appendix. Kant, it seems like according to Kant's discussion, it seems to have no theoretical cognitive function, rather practical or the teleological. So how can we understand their real regulatory function? This is also need to have a further investigation. Okay, that's all I want to talk. Thank you for the attention. Okay.
Thank you, Chen Hao, for the talk. Since we've run out of time, so I suppose that we do the Q&A as part of the informal conversation. So if that is fine for all of you, perhaps the implication of this is perhaps that we should stop recording now and just do our Q&A and informal conversation, because that's where our session officially ends. Is that fine? Great.
You know.
Any comments and questions